serious really is the investigation so far against this White House? We earlier have been talking about whether there's any possibility of impeachment. Of course, that seems to be very far away from where we are, isn't it?
No doubt. Look, Democrats have been talking impeachment from the day Donald Trump was elected. They couldn't accept his presidency, and they tried to undermine him at every stage. So one thing is for sure, the FBI is investigating. We now have a special counsel appointed, and they need to do their job. But the White House will cooperate, and I don't see anything right now that will jeopardize, from what is known publicly, either Jared Kushner or the White House itself. But one thing is for sure, the only crimes that have been committed that I see are by those who leak confidential and classified information to third parties who had no business receiving that information.
All right, we see already quite a lot of trading of accusations on different camps. Mr. Pruitt, the so-called back channel of communication has been a key phrase in this overall investigation. How much do you think so far the FBI or the special investigation from the Capitol Hill really have towards those crucial to the overall White House administration?
Well, I think it's clear from what's available in the public view right now that they have tapes of telephone calls that were intercepted and probably much more information than you or I may imagine otherwise at this point. Quite frankly, following up on your previous guest's comments, I think it is early in the process. I think there's probably a good deal more information to flow forward. There are actually more investigations than the FBI and the special counsel. You've got congressional committees that are also looking into the activities. And I think given the totality of all of that insight and oversight, it's hard to imagine that there aren't going to be some facts that will come out that will be problematic. Whether or not they rise to the legal standard required for impeachment, again, I agree, it's much too early to tell.
Okay. Even though it is too early to tell, the press has been crazy about this, of course, according to some of the latest reports. For example, from the Washington Post, that Russian ambassador, Mr. Sergei Kisyak, was even taken aback by the suggestion of allowing an American to use Russian communications gear at his embassy or consulate, a proposal that would have carried security risks for Moscow as well as for the Trump team. But that was the report being mentioned in information related to what Mr. Kushner's role has been or could have been in relations to Russia during the transitional presidency. Let me ask you, Mr. Babich, in Moscow, what do you make of these kinds of information, particularly regarding from the Russian perspective?
Well, I think that in this situation, the Russian perspective will not be very different from the perspective of any person in the world who wants peace and who wants security. I think it's a very unseemly witch hunt going on in the United States, because the accusations against Mr. Kushner, the accusation that he tried to create a back channel of how shall I call it, trusted communication between Washington and Moscow, I don't see anything criminal in that. I mean, in the worst times in Russia-US relations, in Soviet-US relations, there was a back channel. Let me remind you that basically the hotline of communication between the Kremlin and the White House was established I think after the Cuban crisis of 1962, and it was used in 1967 when there was a threat of a global conflict over the advancement of Israeli aviation into the Syrian territory.
Right.
So I don't see anything criminal, anything terrible about it. It would be terrible if there had been no trusted communication channels between Moscow and Washington, if everything had to be done in public, with the public being represented by the newspapers like the Washington Post and the New York Times. You know, these newspapers basically, I think, disqualified themselves during their presidential campaign in the United States. They were so anti-Trump, obviously biased,
let me just
that I can't call them, you know, oversight.
Let me just pick up some point you mentioned, Mr. Babich, particularly the point to Mr. Pruitt. That is, you know, there have been back channels for consultation between governments. Nothing can be done 100% in the public eyes. That's the argument from Mr. Babich. That has also been the argument coming from some of the diplomats, in fact, and also people on foreign relations in Washington. So what is wrong this time with the so-called back channel?
Well, there's nothing in theory wrong with back channels. I think they're used internationally. They're also used domestically here. When I worked in the Congress, there were back channel communications between Democrats and Republicans on a daily basis that were carried out. The issue here, I think, is the intent, and that's what we don't really know the answer to. And until we get the answer to what was the intent of the back channel, as your guest in Moscow points out, there were specific events and activities that were going on where the communication that needed to take place couldn't, for a number of reasons, take place in the public eye. So I think let's figure out and let's find out what the intent was, and then we can make a fair and balanced judgment of whether or not what Mr. Kushner was doing was indeed either purposeful and within the confines of the law, or whether his intent was somehow filled with malice.
Mr. Blakeman, you heard from the other two guests. One is saying, well, there were those cases back, so-called channels of communication. It happened with President Obama when it comes to Cuba issues. It happened with former Soviet Union, with the United States. It even happens between Beijing and Washington, D.C. during the days before the diplomatic relations was opened between the two countries. So, but now there seems to be a purpose issue. What exactly is that purpose? Do you agree with what Mr. Pruitt just said?
Yes, I think that it's perfectly normal to have or establish back channel communications. The question is, what was not only the intent, but what actually occurred during those back channel communications. I'm under the belief, if you read the press, that it was never consummated. There was an idea of back channel communications, but it was never actually effectuated. So, you know, here we have an idea, but it was never done. So what harm is being done by suggesting back channel communication with some entity, especially the Russians, who are not only an adversary, but are needed in order to have the kind of world order we all hope, and that's a peaceful coexistence.
Mr. Pruitt, I have to throw it back to you. How would you judge, in other words, the so-called intent? If nothing has been done, how can you judge the purpose of it, and how can you convince the others of the so-called intent?
Well, last week I was having a conversation with a particular Republican U.S. senator who I won't name. He asked me my advice on how he should handle this matter, and I said, follow the evidence wherever it leads and then take what actions are appropriate. I think that's what we are stuck with for action plan at this point. The evidence will speak for itself. I think as it relates to the Soviet Union, what this really shows is the day-to-day interaction between the U.S. and many of our friends and allies and so-called foes around the world. That the intelligence gathering that goes on is massive, that what is known within the confines of that community. And now that there's so many people looking and asking, that information will come out. I hope it comes out, quite frankly, in fairness to both Mr. Kushner and to all the parties involved through the course of the investigation.
Okay.
I do agree that with a lot of the criticism about the leaks, but that's not good on either side of the equation.
Yeah, but Mr. Pruitt, before we go to the leaks, which is a big issue, let me ask you continuously about this. I mean, at this point, you see President Trump arguing Mr. Kushner has been playing a significant role in making this bridge between the United States and some of the other countries, Israel, for example, and also Saudi Arabia. He brings in a lot of investment into the United States as well, and also with Russia. So what about those points? Are they eligible, do you think, when it comes to investigation of what role Mr. Kushner has been playing? Meanwhile, what would all of this investigation, which could go a long, long time, means for the governance capability of the Trump administration, Mr. Pruitt?
Well, let me answer your last part first.
Sure.
I think this has the potential of paralyzing all activity from the Trump administration, unless they do as many who are suggesting now, and that is compartmentalize this, set up a whole separate operation to deal with it, and take it out of their day-to-day governance activities. I'm quite frankly not optimistic that that's going to happen, because the way Mr. Trump has historically operated, he's been a hands-on manager, and he's going to want to have his hands involved in this. Or at the minimum, he'll be having his tweets involved in it. So I think they need to compartmentalize this first to avoid the paralyzation. Secondly, as far as, again, going back to the back channel communications, I'm sure, given the nature of some of the other things that have shown themselves so far in this administration, that there's been communications going on that we're not aware of with a lot of countries and a lot of players. And I think maybe I'll stop at that point, other than to say that that's good. We need to be talking to our neighbors and our friends around the world, and I quite frankly would be concerned if they weren't talking to our friends and neighbors around the world.
Mr. Blakeman, a lot really wondered whether it's inside the United States, through party lines, or outside the United States. Is this more about internal politics, the whole investigation and the different kinds of leaks and questions related to them? Or is it about the governance style of an administration? Or this is about the overall way that the United States is likely to proceed in the next few years, given its own challenges now? Mr. Blakeman.
Well, I think it's all the above. Certainly, the president's adversaries are trying to attack him, the same as they've attacked him in other ways since he's elected. Look, the bottom line, I think, is this. The White House needs to cooperate. I agree with Mr. Pruitt. They need to let the investigation run its course without as much public comment or criticism that can be out of the White House or from any other source. But the only crimes that I've seen committed so far are that by the leakers. And I think the president needs to task his attorney general and the FBI with finding the leakers and bringing them to justice. We cannot run a government by having government sources that are unauthorized leaking confidential and classified information that has done more harm to this country than anything that's alleged the president so far has done.
Mr. Babich, you also seem to go into the line of accusing the leaks. But given all of these leaks, would there be trust from foreign governments, from your perspective, toward Washington in doing things with the current administration? Is this likely to lead to the paralysis of this whole governance as we speak?
Well, in Russia, I must tell you that there is that widespread misjudgment in the West that Russia was enthusiastic about Mr. Trump. No. The problem is that in Russia, the majority of people have a very positive image of the United States, especially in the elite. That's despite all the problems that we had in the last 25 years. So the hope was that Mr. Obama's administration was so terrible, it created so many conflicts, you know, the conflict in Libya, the conflict in Syria, the conflict in Ukraine, that it simply can't be worse. So Mr. Trump is going to bring something new into the Russia-US relations. Unfortunately, we see how Mr. Trump is being prevented from doing that. And not only by the establishment in Washington, not only by the leakers, but also by some politicians of the European Union, for example. I was entertained, you know, in the last 2 days when Mr. Trump met the head of the European Council, Donald Tusk, who actually called Mr. Trump, let me quote it, a threat to European security. He has been calling Mr. Trump that for 3 months.
So your point is, Mr. Babich,
this is the responsible talk. Yes, my point is that Mr. Trump is simply hampered from doing anything positive, both by his so-called allies in Europe and by a part of the Washington establishment.
Well, Mr.
And
Pruitt,
I'm not sure that the leakers will be brought to justice, because it is clear that the leakers have helped certain circles, not only in the Democratic Party, but generally in the anti-Trump establishment. They helped them to achieve their aims. Let me remind you that Mr. Flynn was basically removed. His removal was based on a leak which was used by the Washington Post and which became a huge affair.
I have to let Mr. Pruitt to talk also. Give him some space to talk as well. Mr. Pruitt, I have to let you handle within 40 seconds the leak issue. Whose fault is it? Should leak and could leaks lead us to real truth?
Well, the leaks have already led up to truth. I mean, all we have to do is look at the most recent incident in Manchester in the UK and the evidence that was leaked there, which probably will have some bearing on our ability to find and convict the players in that episode. So yes, leaks are dangerous. They can be very dangerous. They can be very enlightening. But we've got to be much more circumspect. And I chalk a lot of this up to the fact that there's no real infrastructure around President Trump to protect him from these leaks.